Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And what I thought I would do is not take the majority of time that we've had allocated to just bombard you with a speech, but rather to just make a few sort of comments up front and then throw the floor open so we can have an extended question and answer session and allow you guys to pick up on issues that are important to you rather than sort of me laying down 40 minutes of blather about my book. What I will do though is just lay out the argument of the book for you very briefly. And I'm going to start by reading something to you from the preface because I wrote it carefully, so rather than try and make it up from scratch, I'll just give to you what I said in the book. We are dealing with a big war, which the Bush administration chose to call the war on terrorism. And the Obama administration seems to be not calling anything right now. But we're also dealing with a series of associated small wars in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, the Philippines, the Horn of Africa, Thailand, Chechnya, Pakistan, and various places in North Africa. Now, these local wars are primarily guerrilla conflicts in traditional societies, but they are at least partially sponsored or inspired by transnational extremist groups whose approach is actually postmodern. So you have these pre-modern societies with very traditional folk ways of warfare, but you then have a transnational globalized enemy whose essentially whose approach is postmodern. I began to think that the war on terrorism might actually be best understood as a form of globalized insurgency, with a vanguard of hypermodern, internationally oriented terrorists, Al-Qaeda and its associates, making use of all the tools of globalization and applying a strategy of transnational guerrilla warfare while seeking to organize, aggregate, and exploit the local particular grievances of diverse but usually tribal or traditional Muslim social groups. And it struck me that while Neo-Salafi Takfiri, a small elusive minority in any society, are often implacable fanatics, the local guerrillas that they exploit frequently fight us because they perceive Western presence and the globalized culture that Westerners carry with them as a deadly corrosive to local identity. They don't fight us because they feel that we are a target to be attacked, but because they feel that we are intruding into their space. And ironically, it's in part our pursuit of globalized terrorists like Al-Qaeda that has brought us into sustained contact with a large number of non-state traditional social groups around the world who interest Western governments mainly because terrorists hide or are believed to hide in their territory. That applies to people in Waziristan, to the Masuds, to the Kuchi in southern Afghanistan, to the Abu Mahal and Janabi in Iraq, and tribal groups like the Tuareg in North Africa, who were really of not much interest to the government of the United States until after 9/11. And the local fighter is someone who I characterize as an accidental guerrilla, someone who fights us because we're in his space, not because he wants to invade ours. He follows folk ways of traditional warfare that are mediated by traditional cultural norms, values, and perceptual lenses. He's engaged in, from his perspective, resistance rather than insurgency. And he's fighting primarily to be left alone. Whether or not that local fighter is manipulated by propaganda or advised or equipped by outside experts, in this case often transnational terrorists, or whether he's armed by an external sponsor, when he fights in his hometown or in his local hills in defense of local identity, he can be a very formidable opponent. And so the dynamic interaction between the modern international system of nation states, and especially its self-appointed defender, us, and these two very discrete but often different and interconnected classes of adversary, the terrorist and the guerrilla, the postmodern and the pre-modern, the nihilist in the case of Al-Qaeda and the traditionalist, the deliberate and the accidental, may be part of what gives these hybrid wars that we're engaged in now around the world, part of their complexity and savagery. And what I suggested in the book is if that's true, then traditional counterterrorism doesn't cut it as a way of thinking about the environment, and neither does traditional counterinsurgency. We actually face a transfigured form of hybrid warfare that's going to take a number of new approaches to think about it. That's the sort of theoretical basis for the book, that when you actually look at the people that are fighting us in the field, it turns out that the majority of them are not fighting us for religious ideological reasons. Let me give you a few figures about that. In Afghanistan, a tribal leader who's also a provincial governor said to me about 90% of the people that you call Taliban are actually tribals. They're fighting you for local honour or for their own self-interest or to defend Pashtun nationalism, and they're being exploited by people who are associated with the Quetta Shura. And I said to him, well, why don't those guys just turn to our side and turn away from the Taliban leadership? And he said, because they know that if they try and do that, the crazies will kill them. So it's the ability of the small minority to intimidate the sort of swinging voter that brings a lot of those people to their side. In Afghanistan, he estimated 90%. When we went to Iraq to put the surge together, one of the first things we did was to do a detainee motivation study. If any of you have ever read much about the Vietnam War, you'll know that the Rand Corporation did a multi-volume, detailed study of Viet Cong motivation and morale. It's called the Viet Cong Motivation and Morale Study, imaginative name. And this looked at hundreds of thousands of detainees and said, why are they fighting? And developed a very detailed profile. Now, it may surprise you or not surprise you to know that when we went to Iraq in 2007, and General Petraeus and I said, you know, why are these people fighting us? Show us the data. No study like that had ever been done. That was the period when the Secretary of Defense and the military commander on the ground used to describe the enemy as evildoers and say that the evildoers hate us because they hate who we are, not because of what we do, if you guys can remember that discussion. And we said, well, let's look into that. And at different times in Iraq, we had held 138,000 people as detainees. When we first turned up at the start of the surge, there were 24,000 people in detention. That's historically a tiny number for a counterinsurgency campaign, but it's enough to get a pretty good large-end survey of people's motivation. So we looked at circumstances at the time of capture, what they said when they were captured, what groups they belonged to, and then any subsequent statements they made while they were in custody before being released. Based on that survey data, which was partly quantitative and partly based on interviews, we determined that 70% of the people that were fighting us primarily for economic reasons. Another 20% were fighting us because they had belonged to a former regime group or a formerly dominant social group that had been dispossessed by what had happened in Iraq after 2003, and they were fighting us to re-establish their position of social or political ascendancy. Less than 10% of the people that we were fighting were motivated predominantly by religious motivation or ideology associated with Al-Qaeda. And in fact, a high proportion of those 10% were foreigners. They weren't even from Iraq. So that's the sort of data set for Iraq. And we did similar surveys in Afghanistan later that tended to show that basically what you have on the ground in most cases is a very, very small number of irreconcilable fanatics who draw their power from their ability to intimidate, manipulate, and mobilize a much larger group of people who are fighting us primarily because we're in their space and they feel like they need to defend themselves, rather than because they naturally support that small extremist clique. In Iraq, we were therefore able to turn that on its head, get most of those people who were accidentals to stop fighting against us and start fighting against Al-Qaeda, and then gradually to reintegrate them into society. We did find that we needed to deal lethally with a very small number of people, but it turned out to be way fewer than we had thought. Let me give you another example from Afghanistan and sort of end on that, just to talk about one practical example of what it looks like on the ground. And this is taken from the Afghanistan case study in the book. 19th of May 2006, there was a very large-scale ambush in Uruzgan, which is a province in central Afghanistan. A patrol from the 3rd Battalion of the 7th Special Forces Group, which is a US Army organization out of Fort Bragg, was moving through this valley in northern Uruzgan. Now, has anyone ever been to Afghanistan or worked over there? Okay, so as you probably know, once you get into one of these Afghan valleys, there's only one route in and one route out. Most of them have one road only on the center of the valley floor. So once you go into a valley, the enemy knows precisely how you're planning to get out, okay, down the same road. So there are a lot of ambushes that happen as people are leaving valleys for the day or moving out of an area where they've been for a while. And this is what happened to this patrol. They're leaving the valley, it's in the afternoon, and they get ambushed by 150 Taliban fighters who were dug into the hills overlooking the road. And they get shot up comprehensively. Okay, 7 Americans were wounded, 1 was killed, and they were stuck there for 6 hours before they were able to escape from the valley. The reason why they were stuck, though, was much more interesting than just the Taliban. It was because of the behaviour of the local people. Several hundred local villagers were working in the fields in the valley when the ambush started. When the fighting started, they all disappeared, and they came back again about an hour later with their weapons and joined in on the side of the Taliban. And they were pinning down our guys in the bottom of the valley and holding them there. And we had to sort of break out through a cloud of local villagers. After the event, we went out and spoke to them, and we said, look, we don't understand. This is not a Taliban stronghold area. We know that you guys don't like the Taliban, so we don't understand why you're fighting on their side. And they said, well, we weren't fighting on their side. You know, we don't like them. We hate the Taliban. We don't want them around our valley. And we're like, well, if that's the case, why were you shooting at us? And what they said was very interesting. They said, you know, first of all, you got to understand how boring it is to be a teenager in a valley in central Afghanistan, okay? This firefight that just happened yesterday, this is the most exciting thing that's happened in our valley for about 10 years. And it would have been totally dishonourable for us, with that fight going on right in front of us, for us to just ignore it and go home and pretend it wasn't happening. So, you know, that would have dishonoured us, so we had to take part. And if you're going to take part in the firefight, you have to choose between the Afghan and the foreigner. You're going to choose the side of the Afghan. So that's the accidental guerrilla system, you know, right there. You have a very small number of people exploiting traditional cultural resistance to outsiders and manipulating people's response. In Iraq, it was even worse, where the Sunni community was under just lethal pressure from the Shia community, and Al-Qaeda, over a period of time in 05-06, managed to convince them that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was the only thing standing between the Sunni community and genocide at the hands of the Shia. And what they were doing was basically exploiting people's fear and intimidating the Shia community into supporting them. What we were able to do was to break that cycle of violence and to show the population that Al-Qaeda doesn't actually have your best interests at heart. And we were able to break that intimidatory cycle. As soon as we broke the spell, whole tribes and villages and cities started turning against Al-Qaeda and moving to the side of the government of Iraq in some cases, or the coalition in others. So what I guess I'm saying in the book is there's another way to go about this, you know, because it turns out that if you invade people's countries in order to deal with a small terrorist clique that happens to be there, they don't like it very much, you know, and they turn against you and they close ranks and expel you. It's like wading into somebody else's domestic dispute. Once the outsider comes in, everybody turns against them. And so in the book I suggest that there are other ways to do it. Before I get to that in the book, I have a couple of other examples. I talk about the conflict in East Timor in 1999 to 2005, which is kind of the case of the dog that didn't bark. In 1999, 10,000 troops from 22 foreign countries intervened right into the middle of a civil war in East Timor, and there was no major backlash effect. So I asked the question, well, why was that? Why did it not happen in East Timor when it happened in all these other places? And the first question I asked was, is this a Muslim thing? You know, is it that the accidental guerrilla phenomenon is in fact unique to the Muslim world? Because in East Timor, both the insurgents and the people on the side of the government were all Catholic. So I went in and had a detailed look at my own field notes from my PhD research when I was there, and turns out it has nothing to do with religion. We saw exactly the same phenomena with the Catholic population in East Timor as we saw with the Iraqis and the Afghans. It's not a function of religion, it's a function of traditional society. Then the other example that I looked at was southern Thailand. And I said, what happens if you don't send a foreign intervening force into a fight that claims to be a jihad? In southern Thailand, there are 3 provinces where people have turned against the government and are fighting what they call a Muslim jihad. So I went in and analysed that situation on the ground. And the first thing I did was spoke to a bunch of experts from Thailand's National Reconciliation Council, who'd been working with these tribal groups for several years. And I said, explain to me the religious breakup of Thailand. And they said, well, Thailand is 95% ethnic Thai Buddhist. The other 5% are Muslims. And I said, how many of those Muslims are ethnic Thai? And they said 1 out of the 5% is ethnic Thai, the other 4% are ethnic Malay. So then I asked the obvious question, how many ethnic Thai Muslims are involved in the fight? None. They're all ethnic Malay. So what this actually is an ethnic Malay separatist insurgency, which is where Islam is the language but not the logic of the fight. The third example that I looked at in my sort of comparative examples was Pakistan. And that's just a whole different situation. But essentially, Pakistan is the ancestral home of this accidental guerrilla phenomenon. I used the example of Damadola. Damadola is a village in Bajar Agency, which is in the northern part of the FATA, the federally administered tribal agencies. And I start with January 2006, when the CIA launched a predator strike against Ayman al-Zawahiri, where he was believed to be in a house in Bajar Agency, and killed about 32 people, none of whom turned out to be associated with Ayman al-Zawahiri, but led to major rioting across most of Pakistan. And I say, let's look at this village of Damadola. And I go back to look at Churchill's book. And Winston Churchill, when he was about 20 years old, he was probably a little older than that, went to Pakistan, what is now Pakistan, as part of the Malakand Field Force, fighting in a tribal war against tribes all across this area. The last time before now, when all the tribes were in rebellion, was in the late 19th century. And he talks about how they went into a valley, they fought all the locals because they rejected them, they didn't support the religious extremists, but they really didn't want British guys coming into their valley. They fought these people to a standstill, and eventually the only way they could deal with it was to blow up a bunch of villages in the valley. And one of those villages was Damadola. So I then looked at the history of Damadola between when Churchill blew it up in 1897 and when we blew it up in 2006, and it turns out that Western powers have been periodically going into this area and punitively blowing up villages for about the last 120 years. Surprise, surprise, people up there don't like us very much. And it probably doesn't have a lot to do with whether or not you're George Bush or whether Osama bin Laden happens to be hiding in the valley. It's to do with this dynamic that's been repeated for 120 years of external punitive raids coming in and treating the population in a transactional fashion. You know, hand over the bad guy and we'll leave you alone. That's the sort of Pakistan paradigmatic example. Then the final example in the book is Western Europe. And I say, let's not think that this tendency that we've identified here is solely restricted to hill tribes in the developing world. And I went out on the ground with various security agencies and Muslim community leaders in Western Europe, and basically you see a very similar phenomenon, where as immigrant populations in the West become better integrated into their parent societies, they all go through a very similar pattern. In the first generation, there isn't a lot of violence internally to the immigrant community. Violence and crime and participation in terrorist activity spikes in the second generation, and then it tends to go down rapidly after that. And I went back to the anthropological literature and looked at the literature on detribalization in Africa. And it turns out that this pattern's been identified before in modernizing societies. In traditional society, there are various culturally determined pathways for dealing with conflict. And in a fully traditional society, there actually isn't a lot of internal conflict because those pathways are very well developed. In modern societies, rule of law substitutes for those traditional culturally defined conflict resolution mechanisms. And so in fully modernized and integrated societies, including immigrant populations that have been integrated into a parent society, there also isn't a lot of violence and crime. But the violence spikes in the second generation because the cultural systems break down before the rule of law and all the other new parent state-based systems come into being. So we've seen this in modernization processes in all sorts of countries around the world. We've also seen the exact same problem and the exact same solution, if you like, in Western immigrant populations. So what I said out of that, and I did a lot of work with European security services coming out of this field research, was we have tended to look at Muslim populations in the West as a fifth column. Turns out they're not that. They are an at-risk population that's vulnerable to manipulation by very small cliques of extremist terrorists. And it turns out that the best way to reduce the violence and reduce the support for extremism in immigrant communities is not to go in there with a heavy-handed response, which just creates accidental guerrillas who fight you back. It's to work with traditional community leaders to preserve flexible dispute resolution mechanisms and traditional authority long enough that they can still have that peaceful conflict resolution function until law and order processes kick in. And a lot of what the Europeans are doing now in counter-terrorism work is based on some of those insights, which we developed together in 05-06. So to summarise the book in a nutshell, I said that there's a cycle here. And the cycle is bad guys turn up, in this case Al-Qaeda. You don't like them particularly, but they manipulate you and they intimidate you. And I called that stage of the cycle infection, because it usually happens when you've already seen some kind of violence or societal breakdown. The next stage is contagion, where as a result of establishing that safe haven in your society, the bad guys go out and do something that brings an external response. You know, they mount a terrorist attack, or they spread crime, or they do something which causes the international community to respond. At that point, the international community comes in and intervenes, and then the fourth phase is rejection, where the external actor coming in and disrupting your society turns you against them. And I use the analogy of, you know, burglars move into a house in your neighbourhood. They intimidate you and they stop you from reporting them to the police. Eventually they go out and do a robbery in some other district, and the army turns up and starts blowing up houses in your district to find the burglars. Whose side are you going to be on? Probably not the side of the army. And that's the phenomenon, the accidental guerrilla. So let me stop there and kind of throw it open. There's a lot of kind of topical discussion about policies in Afghanistan and policies in Iraq. I'm happy to talk about that, but I'm sure there's other things you probably want to discuss as well. So why don't we just throw the floor open and we'll start the discussion. Yeah.
The Sunni awakening, or whatever name we want to get to, turning around at least that section of Iraq. How much was Zarqawi's kind of extremist activities for AQ in Iraq? How much was that a key in turning that population against Al-Qaeda in Iraq?
Yeah, the Sahwa in Anbar was the fifth one that had happened in Iraq since 2003. The preceding four had failed, primarily because although the tribes already wanted to turn against Al-Qaeda, they didn't have anyone to protect them when they did. And the Al-Qaeda guys brutally suppressed the first four attempts by the tribes to turn against them. So what happened in 2006 was two things. Firstly, basically Al-Qaeda had overstayed their welcome to the point where people just did not want them anymore. But secondly, we finally provided enough troops on the ground to make people feel that if they turned against Al-Qaeda, they would survive the attempt. And once a few people turned against Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda didn't cut their heads off, people started to think, oh, we can get away with this, and rapidly there was this snowballing effect where everybody turned against them. Al-Qaeda's part of that came about because they were just so incredibly brutal to the population. We used to go into districts and we would find women with acid thrown in their faces for wearing their veil a little bit too far back. We'd find dead bodies of guys with their first two fingers of their hand cut off for smoking. We had, you know, I won't even get into it, what they did to children, but there was enormous amounts of just brutality that Al-Qaeda brought to bear on the population. They essentially had only one technique for control, and it was intimidation. Once we broke the spell and showed the population that Al-Qaeda can't hurt you anymore, people just rapidly turned against them, and the hatred that they had for Al-Qaeda came out and, you know, was rapidly resulted in a turnaround. And I would contrast that with the Sadrists. So Muqtada al-Sadr had basically a full spectrum system of control. He had a terrorist wing, but he also had a charity wing, a religious propaganda element, a political party, a local communitarian militia, police, various social services, sort of like a Hezbollah model. That was a much more flexible and resilient system of control. And in fact, we made the decision early in the surge not to take on Muqtada al-Sadr until we dealt with Al-Qaeda, because we felt that what was motivating al-Sadr was in large part the fact that his community was terrified that if they didn't arm and protect themselves, Al-Qaeda would attack them. So that's the Sahwa. And there's been a lot of debate about how we were just lucky in the surge because we had the Sahwa happening by accident. They were both two sides of the same strategy, and most of my work on the ground was with tribal leaders and working to pursue the awakening and as a sort of a partner activity to the surge. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. The thrust of what you're saying is that conventional counterinsurgency doesn't work in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and this global war on terror or global counterinsurgency. And you're suggesting that instead of just using hard military power, that a more political strategy is needed. And you can see that in the counterinsurgency manual where understanding basic social structures at the local level is being used. And so, if you look at the surge, and presumably it's going to be applied in Afghanistan in the future, it seems to work to a certain extent, those types of strategies. So from my perspective, when the U.S. Army builds up the capacities for Iraqi Army and police force, and presumably the same in Afghanistan, it seems that these national armies are acting on the behest of the U.S. military and their counterinsurgency strategies. But my question is, to what extent is this external support from the U.S., NATO, et cetera, slotting into political agendas that might exist at the state level and contributing to the ways that rulers manage conflict with different social groups in political society? And could that be somehow insidious in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and it's probably one of the most complex issues in counterinsurgency because you create a patron-client relationship with the supported state, and you also create a dependency relationship with the supported military. Now, in aid and development theory, we try to avoid creating that dependency trap. But typically in a counterinsurgency intervention, the intervening force deliberately tries to create that dependency. They're trying to make it client military. So if you think about it, we never gave the Iraqis or the Afghans fighter jets, right? We haven't made these militaries independent of our assistance. We've actually made them specifically dependent on our assistance. Now, there's twin risks in that. At the one end of the extreme is the risk that as we pull out and we downsize, there will come a time when the US isn't prepared to extend that assistance to them anymore, and the whole effort will fall over. If you think about Vietnam, that's actually what happened. We got the South Vietnamese military to the point where it could handle a full-scale major invasion by the North Vietnamese in 1972 with no US ground forces, completely defeated the largest ground offensive since 1950 on its own, but with US air power. But then due to the Watergate and a variety of other issues, by 1975 we were not prepared to extend that same air support to South Vietnam, and the fuel crisis had led to, or the oil shock, had led to them running out of fuel for their own indigenous military platforms, and the North Vietnamese were able to waltz through the country in about 35 days. So that's one weakness, is you make them dependent on us, well, they're dependent on us, right? So if you're not there, then the system's going to fall over. The other risk, though, is a coup risk, that you're going to find a military that's the strongest, most coherent, best organised entity in a chaotic society, and it's going to end up taking over. And I had this a lot of times in Iraq. I worked a lot with Iraqi units, and I wish I had $1 for every time that an Iraqi military officer said to me, these civilian politicians, they're not representative, they're not democratic, they only represent their party, they don't represent the Iraqi people. And actually, that's actually true, because with the closed list system in Iraq, the Iraqi politicians are elected by a party membership onto the list, not by sort of voters and constituency. And one guy said to me, I won't give you his name, but he was a general down in Mahmudiyah. He said, look, Saddam was a bad man, but he understood Iraq. You guys are good. And I'm like, okay, I get it. We don't understand Iraq. And he's like, right. And I said, well, what do you think we should do? And he said, well, Iraq needs a strong man to run it, and you need a good Saddam. So that was the attitude a lot of these guys had. And in Iraq, the target geometry, shall we say, for a coup is very good, because all the politicians are inside a big brick wall in the green zone, and it has 3 gates in it. You just put an airborne battalion at each gate and you own the country, right? So I think one of the problems we have to think about going forward is that sort of balance between making a military that's too weak to survive by itself and making a military that's so strong that it ends up overthrowing the state. If you want to look at how that looks like, have a look at Pakistan. You know, that's a military that we put enormous amounts of effort into, but the civilian leadership of the state is now weaker than the military, and effectively you have the national security establishment doing what it wants without taking any direction from the civilian leaders. That's just one step short of a coup. Yeah. I'll alternate. Yeah.
You kind of teased us because you said that Catholicism didn't explain why the dog didn't bark in East Timor. Then you didn't tell us
Why?
what was the reason.
Yeah, well, let me talk about the Catholicism thing for a second. This is all in the book, but studies done just before the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in 1974 suggested that about 23% of the population were Catholic. The rest were animatist or animist, if you know what the difference is. And so that was kind of the start state. When I went back in 1999, I did a lot of work with surrendered militia, you know, guerrillas, and also with the population and CNRT, which was the Timorese National Resistance Council, who were actually on our side in 1999. And I estimated, and another guy called Al Petraeus, who did a study in the same year, estimated that 89 to 90% of East Timorese were Catholic in 1999. And yet when I was out on the ground, I saw a lot of syncretism, a lot of people following animist practices, but also turning up to church on Sunday, a lot of people believing in ancestors and spirits and a variety of other issues unrelated to Catholicism. And I saw religious leadership in those communities manipulating the population and mobilizing the population using pretty much the same techniques that we saw later on the Shia side in Iraq. There wasn't the intimidation of Al-Qaeda. It was more of a benevolent motivation. But why was it 23% in 1974 and 90% in 1999? It wasn't because Timorese became more pious, because we saw from field research that they didn't. What happened was that Islam, as it was in the rest of Indonesia, became seen as the religion of the occupier, and Catholicism became seen as a religion of resistance to occupation. And people flocked to Catholicism as a marker, an identity marker, for resistance to the Indonesian occupation. You might not have wanted to take up weapons against the Indonesians. You might not have felt safe being part of the militia, but if you went to mass on the weekend, that was a statement of solidarity for the resistance. That's exactly what people do with Islamic piety in parts of the Muslim world. Palestine is like that. That just shows you that it's not unique to Islam. It's a function of religion as a social motivating tool or mobilizing tool. Why didn't we get the backlash? I've thought long and hard about this, and it wasn't just the sheer naked brilliance of those of us that interfered in East Timor. I think it was primarily because we took a non-political counter-violence approach. We basically said, we don't care what your political beliefs are, we don't care what side you're on in the civil war. If we see you carrying a weapon, we will arrest you. And if you use a weapon against somebody else, we will shoot you. So we basically took almost like a policing approach to just suppression of disorder, whichever part of the population it came from. So even though CNRT were working on our side, they weren't allowed to carry weapons. No one was allowed to carry weapons. And we said, look, if you have political issues with other people, that's fine. You can talk about it, and we'll facilitate that. But you're not allowed to take up arms against each other. If you contrast that to what we did in Iraq, there was a lot of looting and violence and disorder and score settling that happened in the first 3 or 4 months in Iraq after Baghdad fell on the 8th of April. Most of us over there with the military at that time had orders not to interfere, and people just stood by and watched it all happening around them and were essentially directed to not take part in any kind of law and order-like activity. I think that was the difference. I liken it to a normative system. And this again is in the book, but populations in a civil war or an insurgency are subject to lethal uncertainty. They don't know what to do to be safe. And if you can provide a normative system that has rules and sanctions, and you say, do this, you'll be safe, step outside of that, we're going to punish you, what you're actually creating is predictability and order. And it turns out the population will flock to that, even if they don't like the content very much. If your normative system gives greater predictability, the population will see it as greater safety because they know what to do to be safe. In Iraq, the coalition was relatively benevolent in 05-06, but they were chaotic. They couldn't protect you. Al-Qaeda were evil, but you knew where you stood with them. And so people flocked to Al-Qaeda. The same thing is happening today with the Taliban in Afghanistan. 88% of Afghans surveyed in a survey in January said that they thought the Taliban was an enormous threat to the future of Afghanistan. Only 4% wanted to see the Taliban back in government, and 65% of people wanted the Western militaries to stay and help them out. That's 6% better than Barack Obama's approval rating right now. So there was a high degree of approval, but people said, but we can't trust the coalition and we can trust the Taliban to say what they mean and mean what they say. And that's why people tend to flock there. A guy called Stathis Kalivas, who cut his teeth at Chicago University, wrote a book called The Logic of Violence in Civil War, where he basically showed that collaboration follows control, which is a neater way of saying what I just said. Yeah.
I have two questions for you. The first one is about the societies that you studied, and you spoke about the surveys you did in Iraq and how 90% were accidental and 10% were ideologically committed. And I'm wondering when there's variation there, and when the population actually does become more ideologically committed over time, how that process happens and why. My second question has to do with the news percolating in the papers these days that the Sunni Al-Qaeda alliance is reviving, and what you make of that.
Well, I'm going to be a little anecdotal with the first question. I spoke to a lot of guys as part of the tribal revolt who were coming to our side, and a lot of them were really embarrassed by the degree of support that they'd given to Al-Qaeda back in the early days of the fight. And I had 10 or 12 conversations that were similar to this, where the guy, I would say, but hang on, you were a secular member of the Ba'ath Party before 2003. How come you joined, Ansar al-Sunnah, or how come you joined Al-Qaeda in Iraq? And they'd be like, yeah, I don't know what came over us. We just, I don't know. And you guys came in and, it just seemed like a good idea at the time. And then over time, we realized that they weren't who we thought they were. And we kind of went back to, a more pragmatic approach. So it seemed to me like there was kind of a collective madness came over a lot of people in the Sunni community. But if you actually look at the dynamics in the Sunni community from 03 to 06, initially the tribes and the Baathists regarded Al-Qaeda as useful idiots. They were just like, hey, get out there and attack the coalition. We're right behind you, But then over time, Al-Qaeda in Iraq started to apply that very intimidatory approach to their own population, and they just wore out their welcome. In terms of the second question, a lot of Al-Qaeda in Iraq moved out of Iraq. A lot of them are in Yemen now. Some went to Lebanon. There are still some in the northeastern part of Iraq. So the old Al-Qaeda in Iraq doesn't really exist anymore. So I think the notion of a Al-Qaeda Sunni community re-establishment of putting the band back together, I'm not so sure that's what we're seeing. I think what we're probably seeing is disillusionment with the Iraqi government, on the one hand, and secondly, as we draw down, our leverage diminishes. And so all those tribes and all those members of the Sunni community whose loyalty is primarily to us or to an individual American commander rather than to the Iraqi government, those people will tend to swing somewhere else. And it's unlikely they're going to swing to the Iraqi government. I had a conversation once with a guy, it was like midnight in a mosque in Baghdad. I'm sitting there with this guy who was a member of the 1920s Revolutionary Brigades, who'd just come to our side the day before. And he's like, this is great. It's so good that we're working together now. For so long, we stupidly fought you guys and we didn't realize what you were like. And now we realize that, Al-Qaeda are the enemy and we're going to fight those Al-Qaeda guys till they're all dead. And he's like, and then we're going to turn against those Shia dogs and we're going to drive them out of our district and it's all going to be happy days. And I was like, with you on the first bit, but the second bit isn't in the program, right? And he's like, well, hang on, I thought you were, so there's that whole, we collaborated together, but we always had different motivations all along. And I think that's going to be it's going to work its way out in Iraqi politics. Our interest isn't in preventing that from working its way out. Our interest is just in making sure that it works its way out in a relatively non-violent way that doesn't result in the breakup of the state. That's what it means for Iraq to be a sovereign, independent country. We need to get out of the business of thinking we can, interfere in their political affairs. So that's what I see happening in the next 2 or 3 years, is that that'll work its way out. To me, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but to me right now, Iraq looks like Lebanon after the Taif Accords, if you remember what that was like. You've got a government that's just able to police a fairly tentative intersectarian and intercommunal balance of power. And if you think about how Lebanon came unstuck, it was external interference from Syria, primarily. You know, you could argue that Iran may play a similar role going forward in Iraq, although that's hard to justify, I think, on the facts. But I think it is just quite likely to come unstuck, but that's the price of pulling out, you know. Someone back over here? Again? Okay.
The other issue, you talk about the sort of transnationals being infectious, and I wonder if there's a way to stop that infection by defunding them, keeping them from having access to. Is funding important? Is that a way that they influence the places they go into?
Yeah.
Fund them and stop them?
Al-Qaeda typically, when they go into an area, are looking to provide an economic benefit to the population. In Pakistan and Iraq, actually separate Iraq from that. In Pakistan, they did so by bringing in charity money and also by creating businesses, which they funded with their own investment, which brought people into a more prosperous relationship. And so there were a number of people who essentially partnered up with Al-Qaeda primarily for economic reasons in Pakistan. In Afghanistan, the Taliban have done a similar thing with the poppy. So they come in and they try to encourage people, and they actually intimidate people if they're not growing poppy and get them to switch over. That does two things for them. Firstly, it means they're giving some kind of economic benefit to the people, and people have some kind of gratitude to the Taliban. Secondly, it knocks them out of the illicit economy. So they're already doing something illegal that makes it much harder for them to then cooperate with the government on other stuff because they're worried that the government's going to take their crop. In Iraq, they screwed up because when they went into the tribal areas, instead of building a common interest economically, they started taking business from the tribes. So the tribes in Western Iraq run smuggling businesses and trucking businesses and construction businesses, and Al-Qaeda went in there and basically started taking essentially too big of a cut of that money, and also took over. In fact, the way that the revolt started was that Abu Mahal, which is a tribe up in northwest Iraq, ran a trucking business that did a lot of smuggling out into Syria and up into Turkey. And Al-Qaeda basically took that trucking business over, killed the competitors, and started running it themselves. And they were like, okay, that's it, last straw. You know, you can do all this other stuff, I don't really care, but you know, you're taking my livelihood. And they turned against them on the basis of that. Yeah.
We're coming. I have just two questions. So in your argument, you lay out the relationship between these hyper-modern transnational extremist groups and the local traditional pre-modern majority that they manipulate. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the extent of this relationship. Another way, what proportion of the certain elements follow this pattern, which proportions are homegrown? My second question is, as an anthropologist, I was wondering if you could give your opinion on the Defense Department's Project Minerva and the anthropology human terrain teams that they.
The what, sorry? The
Project Minerva.
No, I know project. What was the thing you said after that?
The human terrain team.
Oh, human terrain teams, yeah. Do you have an anthropology background? Okay. Project Minerva is an attempt to apply social science writ large to the problems of understanding modern conflict. All these things came in after I left the department, so I'm not real sure of the details, but as I understand it, it's several $1 billion worth of research funding, which is available to universities and other entities like think tanks and so on, to do social science research that seeks to understand the sort of social dynamics of the environments where the US military is operating. What a lot of people are reminded of by that is a thing called Project Camelot that happened in the 1970s. And I'm not sure to what extent this is like Camelot. I think it's different in the sense that it's not covert. And Camelot was basically an attempt to map the likelihood of countries to collapse. And teams were sent out on the ground teams were going to be sent out on the ground to study countries and figure out the likelihood that they might collapse and do planning based on that. Some researchers went down to Chile, and one of them spoke about this openly, and the Chileans were like, what? You know, it's like, you know, that the US government, the Obama administration just tried to appoint Juan Zarate, the former head of State Department Coordination for Reconstruction and Stabilization. They just tried to appoint Juan Zarate as the ambassador to Mexico. And the Mexicans were, what? The failed state guy? You're sending the failed state guy as the ambassador? You know, so it's kind of like that with Camelot. Minerva is not the overseas research stuff. It's more sort of basic social science research. In general terms, I think it's a good thing. We've seen a lot of stupid research done since 9/11 based on network analyses and sort of the physics of how networks work, which you look at sort of mapping the network and identifying the key nodes in the network and then disrupting the network by killing the nodes. You know, if you did that in an Iraqi village, you would end up shooting the milkman, you know, because those kind of network diagrams tell you who has interaction with who, but they don't tell you what the content of that interaction is. And in most of these societies, everybody has interaction with each other. So a lot of the network mapping, the sort of maths approach, has a lot of problems. And I think social science is likely to produce better results. But that leads to your second question, which is the sort of deep suspicion and distrust between academia and the government. And the anthropology community is probably the community in which that is most heavily entrenched. And there's good reasons for that, right? I mean, the US government used anthropologists in secret research in the 50s and 60s that ultimately ended up harming some of the populations that those anthropologists were working with, which is a pretty substantial breach of research ethics on the part of researchers. The other thing that happens is that if it gets out that the government is using anthropologists to do essentially intelligence work, then it becomes extremely difficult to do ordinary anthropology anywhere in the world because everyone thinks you're a spy. And so the anthropology community has, I think, a legitimate professional issue with the military, you know, recruiting and using anthropologists, because then people are like, well, how do I know that, you know, you're not a spy? In fact, I used to get that all the time when I was doing my field work. People are like, are you a spy? I'd be like, no, you know, but I'm like, no, I'm a professional soldier, you know, and they're like, oh, okay. It was actually easier as a soldier than as an academic. The human terrain teams as an operational tool have become like the lightning rod for this discussion with the anthropology community. But actually there's not a lot of anthropologists in the human terrain teams. There are some, but the majority of them are area studies people who have some kind of background in the area and go in. Anthropologists generally, I mean, anthropology is very hard to do independent of accurate field data. And if you're in a war zone and you don't know anything about the environment, like say you're a Latin America specialist as an anthropologist and we send you to Afghanistan, some of the theory might be applicable, arguably, but where are you getting the data from? How are you interviewing people? How are you doing the research? So it becomes pretty difficult. In the back of my book, I have a methodological section and I talk about what I call conflict ethnography, which is you know, probably akin to declaring yourself a Satanist in the eyes of the anthropology community, but just trying to say, look, if you are going to do this stuff on the ground, what are the principles and how do you apply it? So maybe have a look at that and see what you think of it. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just comment on, briefly, given your experiences in Iraq with the U.S. military, if there were any institutional differences with regard to adaptability or just operational tendencies between the U.S. Army and the United States Marine Corps in their operations within Iraq.
Interesting. The Marines kind of have a Jekyll and Hyde thing going on. On the one hand, they have this long history of involvement in small wars, and they have the Small Wars Manual from 1940. They have all their involvement in the Caribbean in the 1920s and 1930s. They've got this long experience of sort of working that fine line between civil administration, constabulary work, and military work. That's one strand of Marine Corps history. The other strand is assaulting across the beach, you know, and they kind of oscillate. The Marine units that I've worked with in Afghanistan have been outstanding. The Marine units that I worked with in Iraq are outstanding now, but also some of the worst abuses of the war in Iraq were carried out by Marine units before that process of adaptation. So, you know, that's the Marine side of the house. The Army is just so big that it needs systems for everything, right? In the Marine Corps, most officers that are of the same military occupational specialty and have served in the same theatre will know each other. And stuff gets spread around the Marine Corps using a process of socialisation and osmosis. So you go online, there's a thing called smallwarsjournal.com, which is an informal website for sharing and understanding a lot of stuff about the wars we're fighting. That's a Marine Corps thing. It's run by two guys out of Quantico who are ex-Marines who are just kind of working it on a totally informal basis. the Army had this thing called companycommand.com, which was set up in '05 by two captains who were running the, it's like an informal email exchange, trying to do a similar thing. The institutional culture is interesting because the Marine Corps tolerates and actually supports Small Wars Journal. They don't fund it, but they give the guys time off and they let them run it, and there's a lot of institutional permission given to that. As soon as the Army found out about companycommand.com, they tried to shut it down. And when they were not able to shut it down, they hosted it on a military website so that they have military net guys monitoring it all the time. And then they got the Army Center for Lessons Learned to sort of sit over it like a net nanny and sort of inject into the conversation. I see you talking about this, you should read, And so that basically made it like taking your parents on a date, right? And it all just stopped. So that to me illustrates the sort of cultural difference between the two. But I would say the US military generally, Marines, Navy, Air Force, everybody, has been the most adaptive of all the countries that are involved in the fighting that we're in now. The British have failed to adapt. Most of the other Commonwealth countries have failed to adapt. Europeans particularly carry so much baggage with this kind of warfare that it's just politically difficult for them to do it. But if you look at the capabilities of US forces on the ground today in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's stuff you couldn't have even dreamed of back in 2001. I'm not talking about the kinetics, shooting people in the head. That's all there, but it's about cultural understanding, societal knowledge, deep ability to build relationships with the population, all those sort of soft skills that everyone said, they're never going to get there. People are there. So, I don't think there's a problem with the adaptability. There's one question over here. Yeah. You, then you. Yeah.
In light of the most recent bombing in Baghdad yesterday on the Baptist anniversary, and the dissemination of the audio kind of against the Maliki government, condemning it as a puppet of the United States, what do you think the role of the U.S. military or political structure should be in pulling out to guard against this idea that the Maliki government will merely be puppet?
Well, two things on that. What I think the role should be? Nothing. Our goal in Iraq now is not to defeat Al-Qaeda. It's to ensure that the Iraqi state has the capacity and capability to handle all of its problems on its own, including Al-Qaeda. Similarly, in Afghanistan, we're not trying to defeat the Taliban. We're trying to build an Afghan state that's capable of handling the Taliban, and then they're just going to handle it. And that's how insurgencies work. Winning a counterinsurgency campaign is not like winning a conventional war. It's like recovering from a disease. Okay, so you just gradually get better and better, stronger and stronger, and it gradually just tails off. There's not a moment where you win. It's just the state gets stronger, the society gets safer, and gradually you get to the point where it's not a problem. That's what we're looking for in Iraq. I think our job right now is to ensure the Maliki government doesn't do anything that is, let's say, ethically unacceptable in dealing with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and also to continue building particularly rule of law, which is one of the weakest areas in both Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq, do that. But other than that, I don't think we should be getting too heavily into the political survivability of the Maliki government. Sorry, what was your other question?
Well, how likely do you think about this survival?
I don't know, not particularly. There's a couple of guys in the north of Iraq right now who are ex-Baathists, that have come back with this kind of secular Baathist approach. I don't think there's a high likelihood that they're going to take over the country. I mean, that's pretty much it. It's like being a neo-Nazi in Germany. It's pretty discredited in Iraq. I think we need to let them just, get strong enough and do things their way and just maintain a sort of by exception assistance as things move forward. Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the ideas in your new book and those in the counterinsurgency field manual. And I'm thinking specifically, and correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't had the opportunity to read your book yet, and I'm not a counterinsurgency expert, but it seems that some of the ideas you talk about today point to the dangers of facing opposition from people who don't want to be insurgents simply because you have a large footprint on the ground. So in a place like Afghanistan, where there's a long history of occupation. And it seems like there's a tension there with some of the recommendations from the counterinsurgency field manual, which advocates a relatively high number of troops on the ground in order to provide protection to civilians so that they don't feel the need to join some kind of armed movement. So it seems that, on one hand, some of the ideas that you're talking about today
No. Well, I'll go back. We did some testing in 2006, which informed both the field manual and my book, actually. And what we discovered was that a very, very small footprint works and is sustainable. A very large footprint also works and is sustainable, but also expensive. The middle position, where you have enough people in theatre to piss everybody off, but not enough to make them feel safe, is the most dangerous position. And that's where we were in 05, 06 in Iraq. And we did a bunch of testing with regard to Afghanistan on that as well. My concern about the current policy is we may end up being in exactly that position in Afghanistan. We have just enough people to alienate the population and not enough to make them safe. So I think there's a tipping point, right? And you have to decide when you're going into an environment, how am I going in? And what I talk about in here is the anti-Powell doctrine. And I say you should interfere to the very minimum amount possible. If you're not already in someone's country, don't go in there. If you're already in there with a small footprint, keep it a small footprint. But the exception to that is if the country's falling apart and you're there with a very large footprint and it's all coming unstuck like it did in Iraq and Afghanistan, usually the only option is to ramp up, not ramp down. So that's one of the reasons why I recommend against doing any of these things. It's one of the reasons why I recommended against Iraq in 02 and 03, because it's just very expensive and a lot of governments don't realise just how expensive it's going to be when you actually get into it and how long it's going to take.
I guess the follow-up question would be, given current policy in Iraq, or in Afghanistan, what people are talking about now, given the size of Afghanistan and the relative small population density, it doesn't seem like the U.S. is probably going to get stuck in the middle.
Yeah, we are. Well, it depends on what happens in the next fighting season. But I think the danger is that we're committing more troops than a small footprint would mean, enough to alienate everybody, but not enough to actually make them feel safe, and that's a problem. We'll see what happens. I mean, this is an unusual fighting season because you have the presidential elections at the end of it. So we'll have to see how things play out on the ground. In general terms, though, our biggest failure in Afghanistan and Iraq was not military. They were failures, right? But that wasn't the biggest failure. The biggest failure was the failure to have a viable political strategy going in. If you don't have any idea of what kind of state you're trying to create, then it's very difficult to figure out how to go about creating it. And it took us until the April-May timeframe in 2007 in Iraq to figure out what kind of Iraqi state are we trying to go for and how sustainable can we make that. We still haven't really figured that out. Well, we tried to figure it out in Afghanistan, but the situation's changed. And now President Obama, 2 weeks ago, essentially walked away from the commitments that we made in 2002 in the Bonn Agreement and 2006 in the Afghanistan Compact. I don't blame him for that, but it is a fundamental redefinition of the objectives. So, the biggest issue is deciding what kind of state you're trying to create and how you're going to support it and how that's going to be sustainable, and everything else flows from that. Yeah.
In some of the revisionist, military revisionist histories of Vietnam, Andrew Preparation, Master, there's a lot of discussions of the culture of the Army's their unwillingness to transition. And if you look at Tom Ricks's book, it's really about the Army's changing culture. How did that happen?
Well, two ways. The first way was in a whole series of lessons that the military learnt after Vietnam. There's a book called The Nightingale Song, which talks about how a group of younger officers who had experience in Vietnam decided to remake the military, and Colin Powell was one of those guys, to remake the military after that defeat. And one of the key things that came out of that was the system of after-action review and lessons learned and a variety of other institutional developments that were put in place in the military between the end of the 1970s and the Gulf War, the 1991 Gulf War. So in that period, the Army got much better at learning how to do its business. It wasn't focusing on counterinsurgency, it was focusing on conventional warfare, but it was learning how to learn, if you like. And there's a book called The Fog of Peace that's coming out very soon by Dr. Janine Davidson from George Mason University, which looks at that issue and says, how did the Army learn to become a learning organisation? Then what happened was in the 1990s, that same system of lessons learned and after-action review was applied to peacekeeping in Bosnia and various other places, and the army learnt to apply that to a non-standard, like non-conventional approach. Still wasn't very good at counterinsurgency, but it had learned how to learn, and it had learned how to learn about stuff other than conventional warfare. So when we got into Iraq, rapidly the army started to learn quickly about what was going on the ground. The problem then became civilian opposition. Basically, Don Rumsfeld didn't want to admit there was an insurgency, and so we were banned for political reasons right up until 2005 from calling it a counterinsurgency and tapping into the counterinsurgency knowledge. So we're essentially trying to recreate from scratch an understanding of Iraq without tapping into, what we were seeing. It'd be like trying to diagnose a disease without ever opening a medical textbook. When we were eventually allowed to do that, we rapidly, got all that counterinsurgency knowledge into the environment. But I don't think it was really a counterinsurgency revolution. Some people have called it that. It was really a long, slow change in the Army's culture in the 80s and the 90s, which then set us up for that paradigm shift into counterinsurgency in the 05-06 timeframe. Yeah.
Many people are concerned about Pakistan becoming another new front because war on terror. You mentioned briefly that a lot of people are also concerned about the fact that the military does have a little bit more power, a little more leverage, at least within government. What are some strategies you see going in to deal with the Qatar region and the other provinces in the northwest of Pakistan?
Right, very complicated question. And the fact is that large portions of the army and the ISI are currently actively supporting the Taliban. And the problem is that the national security systems in Pakistan are on the other side and the government is not able to control them. And that's a very substantial problem. And just to scope the problem for you, Afghanistan is 32 million people, Iraq's 31 million people, Pakistan's 173 million people with 100 nuclear weapons and an army bigger than the US Army. So Pakistan collapsing or going extremist or being taken is a much, much, much more significant problem than anything we've seen in Afghanistan or Iraq. So that's what keeps me awake at night is worrying about how to help the Pakistanis. I can see three basic things we have to do. One is the Pakistani police. The only element in the Pakistani security system that's not interested in fighting India and is more interested in maintaining internal law and order and dealing with extremism is the police. They're also the element that we haven't given hardly any assistance to. We've given most of our assistance to the military, and the military's diverted most of that funding onto programs that support fighting India. The police have been the poor cousin, and yet they're the ones actually in the front line dealing with extremism. So European countries, the United States, international community, I think supporting the police, and I'm not talking about turning them into a counterinsurgency force, I'm talking about just getting them back in the field to do the normal police job of law and order. That would have a huge effect. The second thing is we need political progress in the Fatah. A lot of Pakistani officials that I deal with say, we just need to go back to the old system where we had the Maliks and the political agents and the tribes just sat down quietly under the political agent and it was kind of a system of internal colonialism. We go back to that and reinstitute it, everything's going to be fine. The most sensible Pakistani politician that I've ever spoken to, and the guy who I think was probably the most honest, was a guy called Harun al-Rashid, belonging to the JUI, which is the far-right Islamist party that supports Al-Qaeda. And he's the representative for Bajar, where this village Damadola is. We had a 6-hour conversation and he said, look, why do you treat the Fatah as an internal colony? Just have elections. Let the people vote, let the political parties operate in the Fatah, have local elections, and then bring Pakistani law into the Fatah. Why do you keep treating it as this colonial anachronism? And of course, the American objection to that is if you let people have elections, they elect the bad guys, and people use Hamas as the example. Well, this conversation with Harun al-Rashid happened in 2006. In 2007, they had elections in Northwest Frontier Province. His party stood, and they got absolutely trounced by the Awami National Party, which is a secular nationalist Pashtun party. So I don't think it's a done deal that if you were to have elections up there, the extremists would necessarily get elected. And even if they do, at least you know who's in charge and you can make a deal with them. Right now, we're trying to make deals with people that are patently not in charge of anything. And so it's very difficult to make those deals stick. So, political progress in the Fatah, supporting the Pakistani police, and maybe broaden it out from the police to judiciary, rule of law generally. That's been one of our weakest areas in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's certainly very weak in Pakistan. Not necessarily a solution, but it's a start. Yeah.
Question about missile attacks in border areas spreading also to Captain Province, Washington Post today is reporting. And that is, does that create accidental guerrillas? And if it does, where's your target?
The accidental guerrilla syndrome is alive and well in Pakistan. Right now, the main object of that syndrome is the Pakistani military itself. In 2002, the Pakistani regular army went into the Tirah Valley. It's the first time they'd ever gone in on a war footing since 1947. And they fought the tribes and lost. And between 2002 and 2004, there was this heavy fighting. Eventually, they declared a ceasefire and had a thing called the Shakai Peace Agreement, where Nek Mohammed, who was the leader of a tribal militia, was essentially anointed as the representative of this faction, which is now called Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban. So what happened was the army went in, alienated the population, there was a big tribal backlash, and then extremists gained control of that, and now it's unified, not quite unified, into this Pakistani Taliban movement. That's the classic accidental guerrilla thing. But it's internal, right? It's the Pakistani government against its own population. Our role in that has been pretty negative, and I'm on record as saying we should just call off the drone strikes. We have done a lot of damage to Al-Qaeda senior leadership using the drones. We've also done some damage to the Taliban leadership, not a huge amount, but some. But we've also created hundreds of accidental guerrillas in that process. And every time we do a drone strike, there are riots all over Pakistan, and the extremists get stronger in their appeal to the local population. Without getting into the ethnography of Pashtuns, the fact is, as soon as you kill someone's cousin, they hate you for life, right? This is not like, oh, we're going to bring some benefits to you and you're going to stop hating us. Every time we kill, you think about that thing with Ayman al-Zawahiri. 32 women and children were killed in that strike. We didn't get the target. 32 women and children is probably representative of 5 or 6 families, because it was a Loy Akhtar celebration, like Eid al-Fitr, the end of Ramadan, okay? That means that there's whole villages up there that are going to hate us forever now. And the same gets repeated every time we do a strike. So to the extent that the drone strikes help us deal with Al-Qaeda, then that's great. But if it also causes Pakistan to collapse, we're going to wish we hadn't done them. So my suggestion is we should just call them off.
Then how do you get the experience?
Does it really matter?
Well, some might argue that if you have a piece of territory that you can control, that allows you to engage in training and planning operations that then you can export to U.S. homeland.
Right, but you said if you don't get the terrorists, right?
You don't get the experience.
Right, but see, let me give you 2 scenarios for the death of Osama bin Laden. One is we go in and kill him with a predator. United States kills Osama bin Laden. That makes all of us feel really good. It makes the guy into a martyr and a perpetual symbol of resistance to the United States. The idea of Al-Qaeda, which is Al-Qaeda now, never goes away. Let's think of another scenario, which is people in the Fatah get tired of Osama bin Laden, just like the Arabs got tired of AQI in Al-Anbar, and they take him out. And they say, Mr. bin Laden, you're a traitor to Islam. You brought nothing but damage to us. Most of the people you've killed have been Muslims. We reject you and reject everything you stand for. And now we're going to cut your head off on television, right?
I think we can afford to wait for that.
Osama bin Laden hasn't mounted any attacks since 9/11. The power of Osama bin Laden is not in his ability to run attacks. It's in his symbolic ability to inspire other people to carry out attacks. So while he's David against Goliath and he's out there defying the West and we're trying to kill the guy and failing, we make the guy's propaganda narrative stronger. The more we can win over the population in areas like the Fatah, we or the local government can win them over and cause them to reject him. To that extent, we can end the problem. And hey, you know what? People say that's not possible. We just did it in Iraq. That when we went into Iraq, 3,000 people a week were getting killed, 125 civilians a night. And we'd been killing Al-Qaeda leaders for years, but it had no effect on the conflict. As soon as we started winning the population over, Al-Qaeda was history, because we forgot, chasing the bad guys and focused on protecting the population. Applying some of that same logic to the world's Muslim population is much more likely, I think, to have a beneficial effect than continuing to try and kill Osama bin Laden. So I'm not against striking. I'd love to see the guy dead, but I would like to see a Muslim tribal raiding party take him out, not one of ours.
But isn't that the exact problem? The people you're surrounded by in that whole region support what you're
Who are you talking about?
Mention his name, I can't pronounce it.
Harun Rashid. Yeah, but see, that's a guy who was then voted out of office because the people didn't support what he stood for, right? So let me take the example of Indonesia. Every time JI does a bombing in Indonesia, their popular support drops dramatically. And they eventually got to the point where they realized that, and a whole big wing of Jemaah Islamiyah is now saying, this is silly. Every time we do a bombing, most of Indonesia turns against us and we lose popular support. Let's just rejoin the political process and get elected. And hey, you know what? If they're not doing terrorism and they're just trying to get elected and they're standing and falling on the merits of their ideas, I think we can live with that. You know, so that's kind of the model where I think we should be going. But in terms of Pakistan, I think we overstate. I mean, has anyone else been out in the ground in the Fatah? Someone else who's been out to Afghanistan? Okay, well, a lot of us think of, you know, that sort of South Park image of Osama bin Laden hiding in a cave, right? It's not like that, okay? It's villages, it's valleys, it's very well developed. There's a pretty major economy there. I guarantee you thousands of people today know where bin Laden's going to sleep tonight. The problem is not that we don't know where bin Laden is. Thousands of people know where bin Laden is. The problem is giving those people that know where he is some kind of motivation to turn him in or do something about it. And we've never successfully given them that motivation because we've always come in and struck them instead of coming in and partnering with them to get rid of him. So that's kind of the model. And again, I wouldn't be putting this forward as a way forward if we hadn't already demonstrated that it can work. And you know, we've turned around a war that was a total failure in a matter of 9 or 10 months by applying this population-centric approach. It's not going to work everywhere. It's going to look different in different places, but it's better than, you know, like I said, bulldozing houses because there's a burglar somewhere in the street, which is kind of how our approach has been to date. Yeah.
You've mentioned the objectives of population protection and of developing the local infrastructure for national security, like police and a local army. How do we balance those when they come into competition, like, for example, in Iraq, where a lot of Sunnis view the police and the army as being fundamentally just Shia militias? Is there a balance that can be struck there?
Yeah, I mean, the other big balance is between civilian and military development assistance. I once had quite a big run-in with the US military about what we were doing in southern Philippines. Because there was an intention to go in and construct roads in the southern Philippines using military CBs, you know, naval construction battalions. And they said, look, the reason the government can't reach its population is because there aren't road systems that allow it to get around. So we need to go in there and build these road systems, and then that'll strengthen the civilian administration in the southern Philippines. The Philippines government was saying, we don't want them. We don't want these roads. Just let us do it in our time. And we were like, no, we know what you know better than, we know what you need better than you do, and we're going to build these roads. And I was at the State Department. I went over and talked to the military guys, and I was like, look, what happens when you take a military unit in to build a road is the local military get empowered, not the local civilian government. That's what the Filipino leaders were worried about. They're worried about the armed forces of the Philippines being seen as rescuing the local population, and them having a loyalty to the US military and the armed forces of the Philippines rather than to the Filipino government. And they said better it not be done than that the military does it. And we said, okay, well, we'll have to find a creative way of doing it. Let me tell you a story about Afghanistan to illustrate what that might do. This isn't in the book because it's going to be in my next one. But in 2006, we had a micro hydroelectricity plant project running in Afghanistan. I don't know if you guys have ever seen these things. Anyone seen one of these? They're about this big, and it has like a 15-inch water intake. It runs a turbine and produces enough power to light a couple of streets or run a sawmill or a clinic or a school, whatever. It's a great little device. You know, if you have a hobby farm, it's a great little piece of kit. They've worked all over the world in Colombia and Pakistan, various other places. We had this project in Afghanistan where we were trying to introduce these micro hydro plants. And the project was failing in the middle of 2006. And Secretary Rice sent me out to take a look. And it turned out that what was happening was we would produce these things in a factory in Kabul where we had about 70 Afghans working. Then we would stick a USAID sticker on the side with clasped hands from the American people, you know, the sticker I'm talking about. And we would take it out and we would give it to villages. And we would say, hey, benefit for you, gift from the American people, here is a micro hydro plant. And the villagers would say, well, whose water is going to get diverted from their crops to run through this hydro plant? And we'd be like, okay, and we'd solve that dispute. And then they'd say, well, whose land is going to be taken up to put the plant on? We'd have to handle that. And then they'd say, well, there's only enough power here to power two streets, but there's 5 streets in my village. So who's missing out on the power? We'd have to handle all those issues. So we'd be in this immediate dispute resolution thing. Then we put it out on the ground. We finally resolve all that stuff. We build the thing. And what you have is a beacon of American government presence with a big USAID sticker on the side, sitting out in the middle of nowhere that we can't protect. And it's a red rag to the enemy. So 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, they come along and blow it up, okay? And then your problems really start, because these guys have been flying first class for 2 weeks, and now they're back in coach, right? And they're like, someone blew up your hydro plant, give us another one. And if you don't give them another one, they hate you forever, because now they're back in darkness and they know what it's like to have electric light, right? So we have to give them another one. Taliban comes along, blows it up, and we're back where we were. And then the Taliban got smart, and instead of blowing them up, they just started stealing them. So we were effectively providing hydro plants to the Taliban. And at the end of 2006, when I was doing the survey, we were just going into Nuristan. Nuristan's an area in northeastern Afghanistan. Anyone seen that Sean Connery movie, The Man Who Would Be King? Okay, that's Nuristan. Okay, it's a pretty remote area. And we had never been in there before 2006. And I'm sitting in this place in Afghanistan next to a CIA officer. And we're looking at the satellite imagery of the area that we're about to go into. And I'm like, what is that thing on the ground? And we're dialing up the focus and having a look. And I'm like, is that a vehicle? And he's like, no, I think it's a heavy weapon. And we bring up the magnification and we're like, damn it, it's one of our hydro plants, right? So this Taliban base area was taking its electricity from our project, right? So we're like, how are we going to change that? I know this is a long story, but it's illustrative. And we said, all right, let's get out of the business of providing hydro to the Afghan population. Let's make this a commercial project. So we went in and we restructured the factory. We employed a lot more Afghans. We made a lot more of these things, and we set the price deliberately at a level where an individual Afghan couldn't afford it, but a village could. And then we put an advertising campaign out on the ground, and instead of saying gift of the American people, we just said, hey, you know what? There's this factory in Kabul that makes these really good hydro plants. You maybe should think about buying one. And if they wanted to buy one, they would have to get a bunch of investors together to get the money. And then they would go and get the thing from the factory in Kabul and bring it back to their village. And then they're the ones who have to handle all these questions about water and power and who gets the electricity and whose land gets taken up. And it's the bunch of investors who are the important people in the village handling these local issues on behalf of the whole community. What you have is the beginnings of local government, okay? Then they put it out there, it's a valuable commodity, and they usually put a guard or two out to protect it. The Taliban come along to blow it up, and they shoot the Taliban, okay? So the whole problem is solved just by us getting out of the way and helping them build ownership and build their own local economic structures to work it. We still had to provide overwatch, right? We had to set the conditions. We had to intervene upstream to regulate it. You know, we had to protect them ultimately. But by making it an Afghan project instead of a USAID project, we fixed the whole thing in a matter of 6 months. So long-winded answer, but that's kind of illustrative of the whole nature of the problem, that often it seems like the best thing to do is get in there and fix the problem for them, but turns out that that's sometimes the worst thing to do.
I'm afraid we're about out of time. Dr. Kilcullen will sign some books at the back if you're interested. So please join me in thanking him for a great...
Thank you.